With us today is Caroline Wilson, Richard Hines, and making his debut on OffSiders, David Davutovic, who's soon be chasing the Socceroos all over the world.
Right.
How did you all rate the game in China?
Next. It was a terrible advertisement for footy. They're defending the dubious crowd of 10,600 or 700 by saying that it was raining and everyone was in the hospitality tents, where they were allowed to drink this year. So that was a big tick for many of the Australians. But
do you think there were 10,600 there?
No way in the world.
No, I'm interested, David, your perspective as a football man. You know how big football is becoming in China. The president's heavily invested in it. What hope AFL of cracking that market?
Well, none as a collective. Potentially, I think individual clubs are a chance in terms of netting, sponsorship and whatnot. But, I think football's their big sport. The president, as you mentioned, Xi Jinping, has, there's a massive strategy in terms of football investment, soccer football, obviously. Good on the AFL. I love the fact that they're bold and they try these things, expansion and going international and whatnot, but they've got a mountain to climb.
I haven't got a problem with exhibition-type things, but I do have, if the AFL is wasting money and losing money that it could be spending on other parts of the game.
Look, Paul, this has been brutal for the Gold Coast. They thought there would be a money spinner for them. Obviously, they have to make it their home game. Very cheeky and very opportunistic by Port Adelaide in making it their game but not their home game, because they don't want to give up a game at Adelaide Oval. They can't contractually. Gold Coast have lost money both years. They haven't got the big sponsors out of it, they hope. They won't go back. I mean, we know how nomadic they've been this year. They finally get back to Metricon Stadium, I think, in 2 weeks to play their first game after the Commonwealth Games disruption. But Victoria, interestingly, are getting right behind this game. We know the Australian government pulled out of Trade Week, which was costly for the AFL too, and they'll do some money this year. But Philip Daladakis, the Victorian Trade Minister, was over there, and he has said, I think at a dinner before the game, he wants a Victorian team there next year. They already put in a 6-figure amount. They'll put in more, and it has to be St Kilda.
Because it creates an opportunity for diplomatic talks and trade talks.
Dairy exports are massive out of Victoria and massive into China. Look, it's a big trade opportunity for them. They want to send over to AFLW teams and they want to play that as a curtain raiser, which I think could work. But I think you'll see, if they're going to game there next year, it'll be St Kilda v Port Adelaide.
Me and Barry Cassidy were at Brunswick Street Oval watching Fitzroy play C-grade amateurs yesterday. That's where the AFL should be putting their money and their heart and soul, I think.
And they should be using football as the vehicle to go into China and Asia. I mean, it's the global sport. Tim Cahill played over there. A chap who, a lot of people wouldn't have heard of, Joel Griffiths. He's a superstar over in China from his 3 or 4 years stint. So I think.
But Dave, this isn't an AFL play. It's a Port Adelaide play. This is their gaming machines. This is their Tasmania. And speaking of where the AFL should be putting more money, but this is where they see themselves as finding a point of difference. So it's really about Port Adelaide and the David Koch initiative, and that's where it has to go forward.
I thought the one big bonus from last night was that the AFL chief was in China. He wasn't watching the royal wedding, as far as I could tell. There was a bit of a clash on there, and he wouldn't have been able to see the coverage and the grounds there just in front of the castle, which would be perfect for AFLX next year. But I don't want to give him any ideas.
I know we've got to talk about another big sporting event overseas, and I'm sorry to evoke my mother's general comment every year, but who would hold a wedding on grand final day?
That's right. Well,
in this case,
I did hear multiple mentions of the FA Cup final during the small piece of coverage that I watched. And David, Manchester United couldn't crack it for some silverware this year.
They couldn't, and just on the royal wedding, there was actually a rumour going out during the week that, or a couple of weeks ago, that Prince William was set to make a mad dash to Wembley in between the ceremony and reception.
He would have been filthy that he didn't get to do his customary handover, and Chelsea playing as well.
I think he had a quiet word to his brother at some stage. But Chelsea obviously winning the FA Cup. The reward for Antonio Conte, the manager, will most likely be the sack. A la Louis van Gaal at Manchester United a couple of years ago. But
because of their poor performance in the Premier League?
Correct. They finished fifth. They missed out on the lucrative Champions League. But look, Chelsea, they just love hiring and firing. Roman Abramovich, the owner, is trigger happy. 12 managers since 2007. And Antonio Conte is actually the equal longest serving with at 2 years.
Let's go to the Socceroos because you'll be heading over to Turkey. That's where the Socceroos are now starting to gather. There are 26 of them at the moment, fighting for 23 spots at the World Cup. How is the team looking?
They're looking okay, but it'll all be determined on how they go at this pre-camp in Turkey. Yep. Bert van Marwijk has only had one camp with them as the new coach in March, and he lamented the fact that there was 2 games instead of 1. So this intensive 3-week camp, which starts today, will be absolutely critical. So 3 spots to cull. And the decisive ones from that viewpoint, the youngest in Daniel Arzani, the oldest in Tim Cahill, and the newest selection in Fran Karacic, the Croatian-based right-back who has never actually set foot in Australia, but does have an Australian passport.
They can't get rid of Tim Cahill now, though, can they? He's the face of the...
Well... That's another point.
Well, Richard's written a terrific piece this week about the marketing that plays into Tim Cahill's, and I would say maybe uninspired marketing too, but marketing nonetheless.
Tim Cahilltex, as he's now known. It was quite interesting that this came out so quickly after the squad announcement. I'm not sure. Some of the images started going up on social media as people noticed what was going on. So I'm not sure if that hastened the announcement, but it was very unseemly having a squad announced in which Cahill was, in some minds, not a certain starter, and then this promotion straight away. Because everyone, of course, the conspiracy theories are it's a fix. Cahill was always in the team because of his marketing value. I'm not of that mind. I think, like you, David, I think Cahill deserved his spot on record, but also because what else do we have up front?
I'm not sure how you judge return on investment for Cahilltex, but it was a PR disaster for the FFA. But look, Van Marwijk, if Ange Postecoglou was still coach, Tim Cahill was absolutely going to the World Cup. And I think Cahilltex did this deal as a major sponsor for the Socceroos. They did this deal when Ange was still in charge. They did all their filming and whatnot back in March in the international camp. But this is the reason Tim Cahill is going. He's just got a fantastic record on the big stage.
But that's file footage. In any other sport, if you look at the minutes played by an athlete coming up to such a major tournament, you would say that person wouldn't be able to be up to the standard.
And didn't a bloke called Jamie McLaren get 3 the other day?
Yeah.
Shouldn't he be challenging for the striker's role?
Just looking at this footage, we were sitting next to each other, Richard, when he scored that outrageous volley, and we were both out of our chairs.
And at the time, it seemed like a valedictory moment. 34-year-old old guy scores. You know, what a way to go out song 4 years later.
Here's McLaren, and this is recent file footage.
So this is last week. Jamie McLaren has scored a hat-trick. He was actually told the day before that he would not be making the Socceroos World Cup squad. So he came out fully knowing that perhaps this was his dose of revenge.
Well, if nothing else, Richard, your petroleum analogies were just working beautifully.
Oh, good.
The smell of an oily rag one I particularly liked about the Socceroos, and it is a statement. 2006 showed so much promise, and yet we're still relying on Tim Cahill as our front man. That's the disappointment for me.
Yeah, and look, as I wrote in the column, it's not just about Cahill, it's about this whole sugar hit of the World Cup. And I think going back to 2006, I think it was kind of worse in a way in that everyone thought, OK, we qualify for the World Cup, all the games problems will be solved. And we were talking about this before, about how at the last World Cup, the games seemed to be finally lighting up. We had the Wanderers were going really well. The A-League seemed to be kicking up. The crowds were gradually rising. That's eroded in the last 4 years. So the game's at a crossroad. And one thing we do know now, no matter how, unless, surprise, surprise, they made the semis or won it, for God's sake, that might provide something. But even just getting through to the second round, it's not a cure-all anymore, the World Cup. It's a great moment. It's the egg or the chicken or whatever comes second, and the things bedeviling the game at the bottom end have to be addressed. I mean, do you agree with that, David? You work with these people on a daily basis.
Completely. That was a fork in the road moment for Australian football 4 years ago. In addition to that, there was the City Football Group, Manchester City's owners, that had just bought Melbourne Heart for $11.25 million. Tim Cahill at that stage, off the back of that outrageous volley, was keen to come back and play in the A-League, and there were talks with Sydney FC, Del Piero, but the FFA decided to take the conservative route, and this is the end product.
By conservative, you mean not expanding?
Yeah, not expanding and just taking risks across the board. We need some bold decisions from head office in Australian football to take the game forward.
They had all sorts of reasons not to do things. They would snow you with figures about we can't do this, this, we can't do that. And so they've done nothing for that 4-year period. They haven't addressed expansion. They haven't addressed promotion, relegation. So I'm of the mind that what the game needs is to energise clubs in the second, third division, play games in 5,000, 10,000 stadiums, not be snowed by the AFL idea that every game has to be 50, 60,000, and connect with your base.
It's the complete contrast to the AFL approach. I mean, I think...
With ground rationalisation.
With everything. I mean, you look at Gold Coast and GWS, I mean, they've lost tens of millions of dollars since they've come into the competition, and that's ultimately the reason why the FFA has chosen not to expand in the A-League. But there's clubs absolutely bashing the door down to be a part of it.
And you're behind the Dandenong initiative?
I'm not behind it, but...
no, as in your back, you think it's a good idea?
Well, there's a point of difference there. So Melbourne Victory have come out and said that they back it. There's plans to build a stadium out in the centre of Dandenong, and only, 5 or 6 k's away from Waverley Park, which
was born in acrimony, not expansion, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That was a completely different story.
So the idea is to take it to the suburbs and make it more accessible for people who don't necessarily have the means to get to the city often.
Yeah, correct. I mean, there's a collective population of about 1.5 million in the southeast, but this is one of about 14 expansion bids. The EOIs are due this Thursday. There is a formal expansion process, but there'll be bids coming from South Melbourne and Western Melbourne, also in Victoria, about 4 or 5 bids from New South Wales, at least 3 or 4 from Queensland, and also some bids coming from Tasmania and Canberra.
Let's talk about rugby because, Dave, final observation?
Only 3 players have ever scored in 4 separate FIFA World Cups: German greats Uwe Seeler and Miroslav Klose, and 1 Pele. If Tim Cahill scores at this World Cup, he will become the 4th, and I believe he will, and he will silence his critics.
And sell a lot of petrol.
Yeah, that's right. The petrol company will be pumped.
Let's hope you're right.